Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to post this video for the most recent Frankenstein assignment, which was for you guys to read chapters 11 through 16. I gave you kind of a little bit more leeway in posting this because I wanted to make sure I gave you enough time to read these pages. It's not that there were a ton of them, but just looking by the number of chapters, some people might have felt a little bit overwhelmed. So this is going to be just a short little lecture to make sure we're understanding some of the more important concepts because there will be a writing assignment posted later on today, which is Tuesday, kind of covering some of the new things that we've learned throughout Frankenstein. So the section that I asked you guys to read was section chapters 11 through 16. And the reason that I chunked it like this was because this was the section of the book that dealt with the creature narrating. So we kind of now have a frame story within another frame story because Victor, who is telling his story to Robert Walton, now says there was a point where the monster or the creature begins to tell what happened to him because years have now elapsed since the first time Frankenstein saw his monster. So when we begin chapter 11, with the creature's narration, one thing I just wanted to point out is hopefully you picked up on the fact that a lot of these sensations and experiences that the creature talks about in this chapter, they would be the experiences almost of a newborn infant with their first, few days in the world. So he talks a lot about the light and how light affects him and his perception of objects and shapes and his first kind of longing, his instinct is to find a way to soothe his hunger. Additionally, sorry, my dog wanted to come in here with you guys. Additionally, aside from just trying to find a way to kind of soothe his hunger, he is very aware of things like temperature and the fact that the rags he has on are not enough to fully clothe him and offer him what he needs. So in the book on page 72 and 73, there's a lot of just this kind of repeated motif about these sensations that he's feeling. He says on page 72, the light became more and more oppressive to me. I sought a place where I could receive shade. It was dark when I awoke. So it's basically him starting to distinguish things, just like a baby would start to distinguish sounds, different sounds from one another, or different shapes or different colors from one another. You'll also notice that hopefully the effect of this narration is that you feel a little bit of pity for the monster. There's no one to nurture him like newborn babies have to take care of them, through these confusing and scary stages when they're distinguishing these sensations. So because he was abandoned, another thing to point out is that his initial actions that we see in the book when he is, out in the forest and looking up at the moon, which is another one of those romantic traits. And he's, figuring out things like fire. He sticks his hand in the fire and then pulls it out because that hurts, but he likes that fire can make him warm. And then he does his experiment with the food where he finds out nuts and roots are better when you put them over fire, but berries are spoiled when you put them over fire. So throughout this, the things driving him, there's nothing in him that we would say is evil or ominous. So even though he looks the way that he looks, and Frankenstein from the beginning has called him a demon or a monster, there's nothing in his nature or his personality that we would say makes him evil or a monster. In this section, we also get his first human experiences. So as he is looking for shelter after he finds himself some food and he finds himself some warmth, the fundamental needs of man, his first human experience is that he goes towards a little shelter that he sees looking for more food. And there's an old man who is cooking breakfast. And his first, on page 74, the first thing the man does is shrieks loudly and quits the hut. So just like his own creator probably shrieked loudly and then ran out of the apartment when he was created, here is another human that is running away from him. Now, he doesn't necessarily understand why. He doesn't get that it's his appearance. But this experience is shaping his worldview. His second human appearance, when he, finishes off the breakfast left behind by the man, he wanders into a village and it's snowing, so it's cold. And he sees some some milk and cheese that has been placed in kind of the windowsill of one of the cottages. And when he goes over to eat it because he doesn't know any better. He just is following his instinct to find food. It says the children shrieked and the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me until grievously bruised by stones and many other kind of missile weapons, I escaped into the open country and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel. So, second human experience, or I guess you could technically call it the third because Victor was his first, is again people not only this time fearing him and running from him, but this time attacking him and causing him physical pain, which is something that he can register. So when he finds this hovel, if you don't know what a hovel is, we can we'll Google it here so you can see a little. Essentially, kind of like a little shack thing. These are probably better than what the monster is saying. I think this is a pretty nice one. Pretty good idea if you're an imagery person, you need a hovel, right? So just this little thing that's in the back of this cottage. So he finds a hovel, and this is the last of the fundamental needs of man. So he knows how to get himself food. He has clothed himself to an extent from the temperature, and now he has shelter. So food, clothing, and shelter. And he decides to make his home here until something can, stir him to want to do otherwise. So just like a beast would, he has found all that he needs for survival. He quickly sees that there is a family that lives in a cottage that is very close to this hovel. So the hovel is probably on their property. And he begins watching them. So his now fourth, we can say, experience with human, he keeps himself hidden, most likely due to the fact of how he's been treated previously by these other humans. But he keeps himself hidden and he begins to watch them. And he notices that there's an old man, a young man, and a younger woman. So he's been able to distinguish people enough to know kind of age and gender here. And he's just watching them. So a lot of what you might notice in the tone is that he's very objective in his observations, rather than saying, oh, they all loved each other. He uses phrases like, she seemed pleased. So he's watching them and learning from them. And from them, which is different than what he saw from the other humans, he notices that they are a family and they love each other. In fact, on page 76 at the end of chapter 11, he says, it was a lovely sight even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. So he essentially, at the end of this chapter, we get the idea that he is going to sit and he's going to watch this family. Now, one of the notes that I put at the end of this chapter is, why do you think he stays hidden? And I think that's pretty straightforward in the fact of how he's been treated by humans before. He needs to remain hidden. So just getting at the notes here for a second, I would just say for chapter 11 and 12, because we're going to get into that here in 1 second, we have an additional layer to the story. The monster is now telling a story to Frankenstein. So just kind of understanding that. The other thing I wanted to point out comes from the Frankenstein background. And one of the things I had you guys take notes on at the beginning was John Locke and his work concerning human understanding, which was an essay that he wrote. This is important because Mary Shelley used this in her creation of this section of the novel of Frankenstein. So I've highlighted just a few parts, and I won't read them all to you, but just some things that you'll notice and see hopefully within these chapters about how the monster is coming to be. Within the first 2 books of his essay, John Locke states that when a human is born into the world, its mind is a blank slate. He states, let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it? By that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety. Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this answer in one word, from experience. So the way that the brain is shaped, people, is by the experiences that they have in their life. So John Locke would be one that is in the kind of sociological camp of people are formed by how they're nurtured in their environment, so how they learn. It's not their innate nature. He actually did not believe that human beings have innate principles, so things that they're born with, or, that kind of like enter into their minds while they're in the womb. His main ideas are expressed in his essay, and they become evident through the birth of the creature. When the creature is first born, he knows nothing of his body functions, capabilities, and surroundings. So there's more on this essential background if you go back and look in your notes, just specific examples of a lot of John Locke's influence, especially in chapter 11, when the monster is kind of first coming to realize who he is. All right, a second part of the Frankenstein essential background that kind of applies to the next chapter is Rousseau's On Education. So, from an essay that Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, the basic of it, and obviously this is a lot less than what I had here on John Locke, was that Rousseau argued that we are inherently good. In other words, we are born good. So, kind of that idea of the blank slate, but more so as, we are good. However, we become corrupted more and more by the evils that are within society. Our natural state is to be good, but a child's upbringing is ultimately responsible for his education or how he learns to be in the world. So through this, what I think Mary Shelley is trying to do, especially in these early chapters, when the monster, the creature, finally has a voice, is we at this point have seen through Frankenstein's point of view, through Victor's point of view, that the monster is the quote unquote bad guy. But here it's kind of showing us that, at least so far, there's nothing wrong with him and how he's living in the world. He's actually almost the victim. So it's helping us to characterize the monster as not a monster, which is an ironic statement that we'll kind of circle back to because it's an important one. All right, chapter 12, I would like to go through quicker because we've got 6 of these to quickly highlight through. But this is a continuation of him watching the family from his hovel. Now, I would kind of start out by saying at the beginning of chapter 12, the tone is that the monster's afraid. He is afraid of what would happen if he revealed himself, and he's afraid of how these people would react. So note that he is one in this situation that is powerless. Nevertheless, he continues to watch these cottagers, and he learns from them. So that whole idea of John Locke and how nurturing starts to teach him through his experiences. And some of the things that he notes, this is almost a chapter that characterizes the family, is that he notices that they are a family, but that they're unhappy. And to him, this doesn't make any sense because they have a roof over their head, they have food, they have fire. So he doesn't really get, at the bottom of page 78, he says, yet why were these gentle beings unhappy? And so his first kind of generalized thing that he realizes that it was poverty. They don't have a lot. The boy and the girl often, when they leave the house in the morning, that by this point we can kind of tell that the father, because he doesn't leave, there's something wrong with him. And we'll find out that he's blind, which is significant. But they often weep or are sad when they leave each other. So he realizes they don't have a lot. And even though they don't have a lot, he still notices these little acts of love and kindness that happen between them. How the 2 younger cottagers will sometimes give their father all of the food and leave none for themselves. So because of this, he learns, which is key here, that he wants to help them. He wants to ease some of this suffering. So Felix, which he learns is the name of the younger boy cottager, he often leaves and spends the whole day chopping wood so that they can keep it in front of their cottage. So basically the monster starts doing it for him. Remember, he's a lot stronger. So he does this and kind of leaves it outside so that he has more time to do other things, maybe spend time with his family or to work in the garden. So they kind of accept this kindness as, this is a good spirit helping them out. So he continues to see their acts of kindness, and he learns what it is to care about people. He starts to pick up on the fact that they have language, and he begins to learn words. He also, unfortunately, one of the things that he learns, and this would go back to Rousseau and his view on education, that the monster is born not necessarily knowing there's anything wrong with him. He knows that people have run from him and attacked him, but he doesn't necessarily understand why. And on the bottom of page 80 and the top of page 81, there's a discussion of how he looks. He says, I admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions, but how I was terrified when I viewed myself from a transparent pool. At first, I started back, unable to believe it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I came fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. So he learns of his own ugliness through a comparison to these cottagers, which is, these people are good. They haven't done anything negative to him, but this is just another example of how society has an impact. By the end of this chapter, the monster just kind of expresses his desire to learn more about these people and how he can help to restore happiness to them. So in other words, he wants to find out what is plaguing them, because even once he starts to help them out and they can spend more time together, he notes that they're sad for some reason. And then my last little throwback to chapter 12, at the end of it, we can see again the romantic influence, as the monster says, "My spirits were elevated by the enchanting appearance of nature." So this good feeling in him brought out by nature. And that's the end of chapter 12. Popping back to our notes real quick. What does the monster learn from the family in chapter 12? Well, he learns the capacity for kindness, and he also learns the difference between beauty and what he describes as his own deformity. So we'll kind of keep trucking along. Chapter 13, some of the intricacies of this. All right, so moving on to chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a continuation of the monster's growing education. One of the notes that I had on my notes page was that I just want you guys to, in the spirit of close reading, notice the first sentence in chapter 13. As part of the monster's narration, it says, "I now hasten to the more moving part of my story." So here we see now the initial objective observation of the cottagers. He's becoming more invested. He's developing more emotional attachment and feelings to where he cares about these people. So that's kind of showing his overall growth. So essentially what happens in chapter 13 is one day a woman in a black veil shows up at the door of the cottagers, and immediately everybody's attitude changes. They describe her first as a beautiful Arab, but upon seeing her, Felix has no more sadness left in him. He's overjoyed. And the monster notices that, they're all very beautiful and happy that this woman, whoever she is, we learn her name is Safie, that she is now at the cottage. Now, one of the things that the monster also realizes is that she does not appear to speak the same language as the cottagers. She has a native language of her own. So, by the process of Felix and Agatha and the old man teaching Safie how to speak their language, which the cottage is in France, so we can imagine that they're speaking French. The monster begins to learn the language as well. And because he has this more childlike mind, he even kind of boasts at a certain point that he's learning faster than Safie is. One of the things that's important here, aside from his education of the language, is on the bottom of page 84. So he spends, 2 whole pages kind of observing the change in this family as soon as this woman shows up, and it's clear that it's not the same type of relationship that Agatha and Felix have, a brother-sister relationship. It's something deeper. So on the bottom of page 84 in the book, it says, "The days now passed as peaceably as before, with the sole alteration that joy had taken the place of sadness in the countenances of my friends." So what he observes here is that this type of love can make you happy. So any type of sadness you might be feeling, love can change that. And this is going to be important later for what the monster, what he requests from Victor. So anyway, throughout the rest of chapter 13, they talk about the different books that Felix is reading to Safie. These are not just books on language, but they're also books on knowledge. So through listening to all this from his hovel, he listens through, whether it's outside their window or from his own little place, he begins to gain knowledge. So he's learning the history of the world in a sense, and what mankind is like. So at the bottom of page 85, some of the other things that he starts to pick up on. He says, "Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base?" So he's noticing the dual sides of man described through these historical events. To be a great and virtuous man appeared the highest honor that can befall a sensitive being. To be base and vicious, as many on record have been, appeared the lowest degradation. So here, from the thoughts he's having from these historical accounts, we see that he's good and he's learned to be good. He wants to be a great and virtuous man, not an evil and vicious man. Now, on page 86, which is the second to last page in this chapter, he says, "The words induced me to turn inwards towards myself." So, through all of these readings, this knowledge, he starts to self reflect and he realizes that he's very different from mankind in general. He says, "I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature of man. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and from whom all men disowned? I cannot describe the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat." So he's kind of bemoaning this education he's getting because now he's realizing through comparison how miserable his situation actually is. He actually has a statement, the very next line, that says, "Oh, of what a strange nature is knowledge! It clings to the mind when has once seized it like lichen on a rock. I wish sometimes to shake off all thought and feeling, but I learned that there was but one mean to overcome the sensation of pain and death, a state which I feared myself I did not yet understand." So, a lot of things that he's realizing about himself. And we've got a little bit of foreshadowing at the end of the chapter. I will soon explain what these feelings tended, but allow me now to return to the cottagers. So, at the end of chapter 13, he kind of sets us up for now all of these thoughts. They kind of percolated in my head, and they made me, figure something out. The request he's going to make of Victor, but he pauses and says it's not time to get there yet. So the last thing I just wanted us to kind of note from chapter 13, how does the change in narration to the monster's point of view affect the reader and the story? Well, hopefully, like I said, it offers you some pity or some understanding of the monster and kind of how he came to be. I like to liken this section to kind of like if you're into any of those true crime documentaries that show up on like Netflix, where they have this criminal and the criminal's done something terrible, but before they get into the crimes, they start to talk about the person's upbringing so you have a better, more full understanding. That's kind of what we're doing here with the monster. Chapter 14, as if we didn't have enough going on already. Chapter 14, let me find my set of notes that I'm looking for here, is kind of yet another frame story in a sense, in a way. Really what we have here is this is now the background of the cottagers. So it's still the monster speaking and narrating. So it's not technically another frame story, but he's not talking about his own life now. He's talking about the family. And we realize the old man finally gets the name DeLacy. So chapter 14, I'm kind of going to fly through just because, not that it's not important, but it's mainly background as to further understanding of this situation. Let me just check my notes here. I don't even have anything really on my notes about chapter 13. So we'll just kind of go back to chapter 14 here. Essentially, the frame story is that Seifi's father was the cause of the family's ruin. So Seifi's father was a Turkish merchant, and for some reason, he was obnoxious to the French government, which is where the family is from. And Felix was at the trial when he heard what the court had decided as far as what they were going to do to this Turkish merchant. And he decides, in the goodness of his heart, that he wants to help this man and basically help him escape. And when his daughter, the beautiful Seifi, comes to visit him, he kind of becomes even more desirous to help this man out because the man's like, "Oh, you like my daughter? Well, you can marry her." And Felix is too kind to say, "Well, yeah, that's the deal." But he hopes that is what will happen. So returning to some of our motifs in chapter 14, we definitely have more about the female role. Seifi's kind of a pawn that her father uses to secure his own freedom. We also learn, Seifi's background about why she's, with her father because her mother passed away, and her mother was this wonderful person that taught her all of these things to be good, that introduced her to religion, but then she died. So we have this motif of, again, kind of almost an orphan and sickness. So essentially, Felix breaks Seifi's father out, and they concoct this whole plan of how they're going to get out of the country. It's alluded to that the whole time the Turk knows that he's going to trick Felix and not allow him to run away with his daughter, even though they, on this journey, start to fall in love. And then one day, Felix essentially finds out that his father, DeLacy, and Agatha, who were well to do people in France, so they weren't always poor, they've been thrown into prison. So Felix leaves and decides to go back for his family. Meanwhile, he tells the Turk to, have Safie stay at this place called Leghorn, and I'll come back and get her. And basically, the Turk is like, okay, yeah, bye, dude, and has no intention of allowing this to continue. Eventually, it's decided that DeLacy and Agatha can be freed, even though Felix was kind of an enemy of the state for treachery. But their whole fortune is lost, and they are exiled from their native country. Oh, excuse me. So the cottage is not in France; it's in Germany. So at the end of this chapter, we find out that the Turk eventually tries to get his daughter to leave Leghorn, where they've been staying, but she has every intention of finding her way back to Felix. So she and a companion leave to go seek out Felix, where they are in Germany. And the companion of the girl dies. And since she leaves her father, the girl, Safie, becomes technically an orphan. So just a lot of these motifs piling up. And that kind of brings Safie to where she is, which is at the cottage in Germany. So chapter 14, a lot of backstory. All right, we got 2 more chapters to fly through. We're going to fly through 15 and 16 and then kind of end this whole section up. All right, our final 2 chapters of the 2, chapter 15 is a little bit more dense, but here we have a couple of allusions. Specifically, at this point, the monster continues to learn, and this chapter is largely about his education. He finds, he describes it as a purse, but essentially it's a bag that has 3 different works in it. It contains Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Werther. So in chapter 15, he essentially goes through and says what he learned from each of these books. So it's a continuation of his education. Well, all of these add something as far as what he starts to realize and the continuation and forming of his mindset. The most significant of these is going to be Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is where the epigram of the book comes from. And the monster specifically says, this excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read the other volumes, which had fallen into my hands as a true history. So even though Paradise Lost isn't really, this is what happened with God and Adam and Satan, he reads it as it is such. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit from this part of his thoughts on Paradise Lost, and this is in your skinny books on the bottom of page 93. He says, I often referred to several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different than mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. So he starts to here realize that Adam, the way that he was created by God, there was a love behind that creation. He was beautiful. He was prosperous. He was given every opportunity to do the right thing and to be in the world. Frankenstein did not offer any of these same things to the monster, his creation. So as he starts to go through this, he realizes he still has the book that he took from Victor the night that he was created, his journal. And as he reads through the thoughts of Victor as he was learning to create this monster, we can see the word choice shift here. On page 94, as he's reading through this, words that stand out: accursed origin, disgusting circumstances, odious and loathsome person, hateful day, accursed creator, hideous. So he learns to hate himself because of how his creator made him, and thus it also makes him hate Victor. So he decides that he really has only one chance for happiness, and that is he wants to present himself to the cottagers. And his plan he devises is to talk to DeLacy because he is blind, and therefore won't judge him as so many others have taught him through experience will. So one day when everybody else is gone, and of course life at the cottage has improved for all of these people, he knocks and he goes to see the old man. And the old man is essentially giving him advice. So the monster kind of alludes to the fact that he's here to see people that he's never met, and he's nervous of their prejudice. And DeLacy enforces this idea of the goodness of man, right? So we've got the duality of nature and man here. The monster says, I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around and have no relation or friend upon the earth. These amiable people whom I go to see have never seen me and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever. So after he gains this education from reading these 3 different books, this is kind of his Hail Mary pass. This is the last shot that he has to find happiness in his own mind. And so DeLacy tells him, do not despair. To be friendless is indeed to be unfortunate, but the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Rely therefore on your hopes, and if these friends are good and amiable, do not despair. So this gives the monster hope because he has observed them now for some time, and in his head he's like, well, they're the best sort of people. And so he kind of resolves to stop being so vague. And when DeLacy says, oh, they live close to here, well, tell me about them. I can probably help you. And as soon as the old man is about to be told of the identity, hey, you are the people I'm coming to see. Please don't leave me. Felix and Agatha and Safie return, and Agatha faints, Safie runs away, and Felix attacks the monster and kind of takes his father away from him. So that's how they leave off the end of chapter 15. Chapter 16 then, right away, because of this situation, so this is the worst thing that could have happened to the monster. His final hope is gone. So chapter 16 begins with something that kind of echoes the epigraph of the book, which is Adam bemoaning his own creation. And it's immediately an accusation against Victor. Chapter 16 begins with cursed, cursed creator. All right. So that word repeated twice to add emphasis. It kind of goes back to, why is the creator cursed? Well, why did you make me? The monster even says, why in that instant did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? So in other words, I curse you for making me. I should have taken my own life in that instant. The irony of what happens next, because he has these emotions and these feelings that have now been hurt, his heart has been broken. He runs into the forest and he starts to howl like a beast. So the irony in that he was trying to be like a man, he was trying to be like mankind, and essentially it's turning him into a beast, the opposite of what he hoped for. So in this section, he realizes now how alone he is. And after he sees Felix rent out the cottage, saying that they can never return. So this is after the monster's like, I can still try again. I'll go back to DeLacy. When he realizes that they are really gone, he says at the bottom of page 100, my protectors had departed and had broken the only link that held me to the world. For the first time, the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them. So we now see that just like mankind has this duality, he's discovering his own duality. He was born an innocent. He was taught to be good, but these experiences have shaped him into something else, these experiences with mankind and with society. So he sets the cottage on fire. Again, we've got the duality of nature here. He, at this point, knows that fire can hurt, but more so he knows that it can cook and offer warmth. And here he's using it to destroy. So the symbolism there that he's going the opposite way. He's going away from goodness. So he leaves. We also have kind of the symbolism of the weather changing throughout the time that he's watched, and his relationship and his hopes were building. It was spring and then summer. Now the fall is come and it's winter, so everything is cold and frozen. But as things start to thaw, the spring returns. He one day hears some laughter in the woods as he's, going through this countryside kind of aimlessly, and he hears a girl laughing, and she falls into a river. and he sees her, and again that innate goodness that he has been taught kind of comes out, and he takes this girl out of the water. It's on the bottom of page 102. And as he's trying to resuscitate her, the guy that she was playfully running from shows up, grabs her away, and shoots him in the shoulder. So again, he kind of bemoans mankind on the top of page 103. He says, "This was then the reward of my benevolence. I had saved a human being from destruction, and as a recompense, I now writhed under the miserable pain of a wound which shattered the flesh and bone. The feelings of kindness and gentleness which I had entertained but a few moments before gave place to a hellish rage and a gnashing of teeth." So at this point, we can kind of see that he's tried over and over again to find acceptance, because human beings have a natural tendency to want to be loved and accepted, and he's found none of that. So as he makes his way, through Germany, eventually he nears the town of Geneva as he crosses into Switzerland, and by chance, he finds this little boy running around in the woods. Now, his thought is a child is someone who is unprejudiced. He'd lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. So he thinks, all right, last straw, I'm going to talk to this child because he has been unsullied by the world. And if he can accept me, that's good. So he talks to this child, and of course, the little boy screams and covers his eyes, and the monster tries to reason with him, and it is discovered that he is actually the son of Mr. Frankenstein, and so the monster says, "Oh, well, now you're the son of my creator. Well, then I'm definitely not letting you go anywhere," because he wants to find his creator, because he's filled with this hatred for him and revenge. And the child won't stop screaming, so he squeezes his throat to silence him, and realizes the power that he has with his size is that he can also, like a god, take life away. Um, so this is kind of the turning point for the monster. Because of what he's been through, you could almost argue, accidentally kills the child because he was screaming. But once he finds Justine in the barn because he had taken the necklace off of the boy, you remember, then he does this maliciously. He sets up another innocent. She's sleeping, the most innocent state that people can be in, and he knows the work of mischief, that if he plants this on her, that she will have to atone for the happiness that was robbed from him. So this is really the turning point where we see him turn into a monster. And so the question is, well, what turned him into a monster? It wasn't Frankenstein that made him a monster, because he was good at the beginning, but it was mankind and society that made him into a monster. So at the final part of this chapter, the request that he has for Victor, because this is the end of the monster's frame story, he says, "We may not part until you have promised to comply with my requisition. I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me. But one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create." So, because he has kind of given up on humankind being able to offer him friendship or companionship, he tells Victor that the reason he has sought him out and kind of stuck around after the whole Justine trial is because he now wants to have a companion. So this is the end of the monster's frame story, and then we're going to kick it back over to Victor. But a couple things to think about at the end of this section. For chapter 15, I hope you looked closely at the exchange between the monster and DeLacy. Do you actually think that if the kids hadn't come in, that DeLacy would have accepted him, right? I guess that's kind of the what if thing. Is this scene tragic or ironic or both? Did we see this coming? In chapter 16, I just want you to hopefully notice the monster's changing feelings. He has feelings that oppose one another. He wants to be accepted by humans, but at the same time, he hates them. And then notice the feelings that have the strongest ability to overtake him. So that's the end of this section. Sorry, it was a little bit longer. Later on today, I'm going to post your next analysis paragraph. So hopefully you can catch up on this by then.